Hello and welcome to Clusters. Well, we've reached the end. This is the final chapter of Acts and the end of Luke's history of the early church. And so we begin this final chapter with Paul, Luke and Aristarchus washed up on the shore of the island of Malta. Some of you may have visited Malta, but if not, it's a few small islands about 50 miles south of Sicily. The small team of Christian men receive help from some of the islanders, but as they build the fire, Paul is bitten on the hand by a snake. It's described as a viper, and everyone expects Paul to swell up or die. But he just shakes the snake off and gets on with building the fire. Nothing is going to thwart God's plan of Paul preaching in Rome. Now these days, there are apparently no venomous snakes living in Malta, so this was presumably a species that's since become extinct. The chief official of the island invites the men to his house, and when he learns that his father was sick, Paul goes to visit him and heals him. This begins a wave of people arriving to be healed of their sicknesses. Now there are no mentions of conversions on this trip, but evidently the locals were impressed. You might imagine that the next missionaries to arrive would find fertile ground for their preaching. And so the brothers spend 3 months on Malta before a ship heads off towards Rome. Again we get one of Luke's travelogues of their journey and their stops in Sicily and southern Italy before finally arriving in Rome, where again they're greeted enthusiastically by Christians who travel some way with them. And then Paul is placed under house arrest. Now it seems that Paul's been treated very well on the journey, being allowed to spend time with fellow believers, and even in Rome he has a certain freedom to meet with the local Jewish leaders and plead his case with them. Remember, it was the Jewish religious leaders in Jerusalem who had Paul arrested in the first place, and their desire to have him tried in Jerusalem, but actually have him ambushed and murdered on his way from where he was imprisoned in Caesarea, that caused him to appeal to the emperor in the first place. Some of the Jews are impressed and believe, while others don't. But this is why Paul was sent, to preach the gospel and force people to make a decision whether to follow or to turn away from Christ. But as we know, this was God's plan all along. For when the Lord appeared to Paul back in chapter 23, he said, "Take courage, and as you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome." And for 2 years, Paul is able to have many visitors to his rented house in Rome and preach the gospel relatively unhindered. And that's where Luke's gospel ends, on a very positive note. Sadly, it doesn't stay that way, and at some point Paul is transferred to a dungeon from where he probably writes the letter to the Philippians. After that, more speculation is involved. He had expressed the hope in his letter to the Romans to take the gospel to Spain, and some ancient sources suggest he may have achieved this. However, it seems that eventually Paul ended back up in Rome under arrest and under sentence of death. He was finally executed as a Roman citizen and probably had the dubious privilege of a swift death by beheading. And so that's it for our studies in the book of Acts. I hope you've got as much out of this as I have. Over the next few months we'll be doing the Living Christianity course in our clusters or at church together, so I hope to be able to join with some of you for that. But until then, I hope you have a great cluster.